Good evening, dear listener. As the day softens and the world around us settles into a peaceful hush, allow your mind to drift for a moment. Perhaps you can imagine the gentle sigh of a desert breeze whispering secrets across the ancient sands of Egypt, or the silvery moonlight painting the majestic stones of a forgotten temple. Maybe your thoughts wander to the quiet stillness of an old walled city, its cobblestone streets echoing with the ghosts of centuries past. In this tranquil space, let us turn our gaze to a time long ago, a time far removed from our own, yet one that shaped the world we inhabit. We shall journey back to the medieval ages, to the heart of the European countryside. But instead of tales of valiant knights and grand castles, our focus will rest on the lives of those whose stories are often unheard, the farmers. The tillers of the soil, the backbone of a world sustained by their tireless labor. Join me as we step into their world, a world of hardship and resilience, of simple joys and enduring spirit. Chapter 1. The Whispers of the Wheat Fields. The last sliver of the sun, a bruised apricot against the vast canvas of the evening sky, dipped below the horizon, painting long, melancholic shadows across the fields of wheat. A gentle breeze, carrying the earthy scent of turned soil and the faint, sweet perfume of wild thyme, rustled through the ripening stalks, creating a soft, susurrating whisper that seemed to sigh with the day's end. It was a sound familiar and constant to Thomas, a farmer of the English countryside in the year of our Lord 1348. A sound that often lulled him to a fitful sleep, a counterpoint to the heavier rhythm of his weary heart. A profound stillness began to settle over the land, broken only by the distant lowing of a cow being herded back to its meager shelter, and the chirping chorus of crickets tuning their nightly orchestra. The air, now cooler, carried the faint smoke from scattered hearth fires, a communal breath rising from the small village nestled in the hollow beyond his fields. For a fleeting moment, a sense of peace, fragile and precious, descended upon the landscape, a brief respite before the inevitable return of toil and worry. Imagine, if you will, this scene bathed in the soft, silvery light of a nascent moon, just beginning its ascent into the inky expanse above. The thatched roofs of the village cottages would gleam faintly, like slumbering beasts huddled together for warmth. The winding dirt paths, etched into the landscape by generations of footsteps and cart wheels, would appear as pale ribbons snaking through the darkness. And across the undulating fields, the wheat, now a sea of shadows, would sway gently, imbued with a mystical quality under the lunar gaze. Thomas's life, like that of most peasants in this era, was inextricably bound to these fields, to the relentless cycle of seasons that dictated his every action and thought. He was a serf, tied to the land owned by Lord Harrington, his existence a tapestry woven with backbreaking labor, the constant threat of scarcity, and the immutable laws of the feudal system. There was a stark simplicity to his days, a rhythm dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the soil, the sowing of seeds, and the anxious wait for the harvest. His small cottage, a humble structure of wattle and daub with a leaky thatched roof, offered little comfort beyond basic shelter. The single room housed his family, his wife, Elara, and their 3 young children, each already bearing the mark of a life of hardship in their thin frames and solemn eyes. The air inside was thick with the smells of wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint sourness of stale rushes that served as their bedding. Light flickered from the embers of the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, telling silent stories of the day's labors. The work itself was unending. From the first light of dawn until dusk painted the sky, Thomas would toil in the fields. Armed with a heavy, iron-tipped plow pulled by his aging ox, Barnaby, he would turn the stubborn earth, preparing it for the life-giving seeds. His hands, calloused and scarred, knew the feel of the soil in all its moods, dry and dusty in the summer, cold and clinging in the winter, yielding and hopeful in the spring. Each swing of the hoe, each handful of scattered seed, was a prayer for sustenance, a desperate gamble against the vagaries of weather and the ever-present threat of blight. The feudal system, the very fabric of their society, offered little room for respite or ambition. Lord Harrington owned the land, and thus, in a very real sense, he owned Thomas and his family. A significant portion of their meager harvest was owed as tax, leaving just enough to scrape by, often with little to spare for the lean winter months. The Lord's bailiff, a stern and unforgiving man, ensured that these dues were met, his presence a constant reminder of their subservient status. Beyond the demands of their lord, the natural world itself presented a formidable array of challenges. The weather was a capricious master, offering no guarantees. A late frost could decimate the young crops, a prolonged drought could wither the life from the fields, and torrential rains could wash away months of arduous labor in a matter of hours. These were not mere inconveniences, they were threats to their very survival, capable of plunging the family into desperate hunger. And then there were the anxieties that crept in with the darkness, the unseen fears that gnawed at the edges of their existence. The dense forests that bordered their fields were believed to harbor more than just wild animals. Whispers of malevolent spirits, of mischievous fairies and vengeful wood nymphs, filled the air around the flickering hearth at night. The cycles of the moon, too, held a potent significance in their lives. A full moon, while casting a beautiful, ethereal glow over the land, was often associated with strange occurrences, with heightened emotions and a sense of unease. Some believed that the lunar light could stir the blood, leading to madness or misfortune. Elara would often murmur ancient incantations under the silvery light, seeking protection from unseen forces. Yet, amidst the hardship, there were moments of quiet connection, small embers of warmth in the cold reality of their lives. In the evenings, after the day's relentless labor, the family would gather around the fire. Elara, her face etched with the lines of worry but softened by the firelight, would mend their tattered clothes or tell the children simple stories passed down through generations. Tales of brave knights and cunning folk, offering a brief escape from their daily struggles. Thomas would often carve small wooden figures for his children, his rough hands surprisingly adept at shaping simple toys. Sometimes neighbors would gather in one of the small cottages, sharing meager food and drink, the air filled with the murmur of voices and the crackling of the fire. These were precious moments of community, a shared understanding of their common plight offering a small measure of solace. They would speak of the weather, of the crops, of the latest news from the village, a birth, a death, a dispute. And sometimes, in hushed tones, they would speak of the wider world, of rumors of wars and distant kings, events that seemed so far removed from their immediate concerns yet held the power to impact their lives in unforeseen ways. The life of a medieval farmer was indeed a hard one, a constant struggle against the elements, the demands of the feudal system, and the ever-present specter of hunger. Yet, within this harsh reality, there were also the simple rhythms of life, the beauty of the changing seasons, the quiet strength of family, and the small, flickering lights of hope that sustained them through the darkest of times. As the moon climbed higher in the night sky, casting its silvery glow upon the sleeping fields, Thomas knew that with the dawn would come another day of toil. But for now, in the gentle whispers of the wheat, there was a fragile peace, a moment to rest before the turning of another arduous day. Chapter 2: The Unseen Hands of Fate. The dawn arrived not as a sudden burst of light, but as a gradual paling of the eastern sky, a slow surrender of the night's embrace. A soft, gray hue washed over the landscape, revealing the dew-kissed fields and the slumbering village in the valley below. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant crowing of a rooster, a familiar herald of the day's inevitable demands. Thomas stirred on his straw-filled mattress, the rough fabric scratching against his skin. Elara lay beside him, her breathing shallow and even, her face peaceful in the dim light. For a moment he allowed himself the simple luxury of stillness. A brief pause before the weight of the day settled upon his shoulders. But the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, a constant companion, soon reminded him of the tasks ahead. The children, huddled together for warmth beneath a shared woolen blanket, began to stir as well, their small coughs echoing in the confined space. The prospect of another day of meager rations and potential chores already seemed to hang in the air, a silent understanding passing between them. The morning routine was a simple and swift affair. A shared piece of coarse bread, salvaged from the previous evening's meal, was their meager breakfast. Water, drawn from the communal well, washed it down. There were no pleasantries. No lingering over the meal. The land demanded their attention, and time was a precious commodity they could ill afford to waste. Outside, the village was slowly awakening. Smoke curled from the chimneys of the other cottages, carrying the smells of cooking fires and livestock. The sounds of early morning, the clatter of buckets, the bleating of sheep, the murmur of voices, began to weave a familiar tapestry of rural life. Thomas yoked Barnaby to the plough, the old ox sighing heavily as the weight settled upon his broad shoulders. The soil in the field was still damp from the morning dew, making the initial furrows heavy work. Each step was a strain, the plough biting stubbornly into the earth, demanding all of Thomas's strength and resilience. Elara, with the younger children clinging to her skirts, headed towards the small vegetable patch behind their cottage. Here, she tended to the few cabbages, beans, and herbs that supplemented their diet, a constant battle against weeds, pests, and the ever-hungry birds. Even the smallest yield from this patch was vital to their survival, a small buffer against the lean times. The rhythms of their day were dictated by the sun. As it climbed higher in the sky, the labor intensified. The heat beat down upon their backs, sweat stinging their eyes. There were few moments of rest. Only brief pauses to wipe their brows and take a swig of water from a shared flask. The work was monotonous, each furrow identical to the last. Each weed pulled a small victory in an endless war against nature's relentless encroachment. But amidst the toil, there were also moments of a different kind. Moments that spoke to the deep connection between the people and the land. Thomas knew this field intimately. Every rise and fall, every patch of stubborn clay, every area where the soil was richer. He understood the subtle signs of the changing weather, the way the clouds gathered on the horizon, the shift in the wind's direction, the behavior of the birds. This knowledge, passed down through generations, was as vital to his survival as his plow or his ox. Sometimes, as he worked, his gaze would drift to the distant woods, a place both familiar and mysterious. He had ventured into them many times to gather firewood or hunt for small game, but they also held an air of the unknown, a realm where the rules of the cultivated fields did not apply. It was a place where shadows danced and strange sounds echoed, a place where the unseen hands of fate seemed to hold greater sway. The beliefs of the time were deeply intertwined with the natural world, a blend of Christian faith and ancient superstitions. The changing phases of the moon were watched with careful attention. Each phase believed to hold different influences. Planting and harvesting were often timed according to lunar cycles, and certain tasks were avoided under a waning moon, lest they bring ill fortune. The full moon, in particular, held a potent mystique. Its silvery light was seen as both beautiful and potentially dangerous. It was believed to stir the humors of the body, leading to strange behaviors and even madness. Elara would often tell the children stories of people who had wandered into the woods under the full moon and never returned, or those who had been touched by its ethereal glow and become different. These stories, whispered in the flickering firelight, held a strange fascination, a blend of fear and wonder. There were also rituals and customs tied to the land and the seasons, ancient practices meant to appease the spirits and ensure a bountiful harvest. Offerings might be left at the edges of the fields, and certain days were marked with communal celebrations, a brief respite from the daily grind. A moment to acknowledge the unseen forces that governed their lives. The threat of illness was a constant shadow. Simple ailments could quickly become deadly, and the village healer, often an elderly woman with knowledge of herbs and traditional remedies, could only offer limited assistance. There was little understanding of disease, and outbreaks could decimate families and communities with terrifying speed. And then there was the ever-present fear of hunger. A poor harvest, whether due to bad weather or disease, meant starvation in the long winter months. Thomas remembered the stories his father had told him of the lean years, when families had been forced to eat bark and roots to survive, their bodies weakened and susceptible to illness. This memory, passed down like a bitter inheritance, fueled his relentless toil. As the sun began its slow descent in the afternoon sky, casting long shadows once more, Thomas finally unyoked Barnaby. The oxes labored, breathing a mirror of his own exhaustion. The day's work was far from over, but the most strenuous part was done. He would still need to tend to the animals, repair fences, and perhaps gather firewood before darkness fell completely. Walking back towards the cottage, his body aching in every muscle, Thomas paused at the edge of his field. The wheat, now swaying gently in the evening breeze, held the promise of sustenance. But it was a promise that could easily be broken by forces beyond his control. He looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to prick the darkening canvas. The moon, now a sliver of silver, was climbing slowly, its gentle light beginning to bathe the land in its ethereal glow. He thought of Ilara and the children waiting for him, their faces etched with the same quiet resilience that sustained him. Their small community, bound together by shared hardship and a deep connection to the land, was their only real solace in a world that often felt indifferent to their struggles. As he finally reached the cottage, the warm glow from the hearth spilling through the cracks in the door offered a small comfort. The day had been long and arduous, filled with the familiar rhythm of toil and worry. But within the simple shelter of his home, surrounded by his family, there was a fragile sense of belonging. A quiet strength that helped him face the unseen hands of fate that held their lives in their unpredictable grasp. Chapter 3. The Weight of the Lord's Dew. The changing seasons painted the landscape in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each shift bringing its own set of demands and anxieties to the lives of the villagers. The vibrant greens of spring had deepened into the rich golds of late summer, and now, a subtle ochre tinge was beginning to creep into the leaves of the trees, a gentle reminder of the shortening days and the impending harvest. For Thomas and his neighbors, this was a time of intense labor, a frantic race against time and the unpredictable weather. Every able body, young and old, toiled in the fields from dawn till dusk, their movements a carefully choreographed dance of reaping and binding. The air was thick with the dust of the threshing floor, and the rhythmic swish of scythes cutting through the ripened grain. The promise of sustenance for the coming winter hung heavy in the air, a tangible reward for months of backbreaking work. However, this promise was always tempered by the knowledge of the Lord's due. Lord Harrington's bailiff, a man named Geoffrey with a gaze as sharp as his ledger and a demeanor as unforgiving as the winter winds, would soon arrive to claim his share of the harvest. This was not a negotiation. It was an established right, a fundamental aspect of the feudal system that bound them to the land. The amount owed was substantial, a significant portion of their hard-earned yield. It was a weight that hung over every farmer's heart, a constant reminder that even in times of plenty, their own share would be limited. Geoffrey's arrival was always an event of quiet dread, a moment when the fruits of their labor would be measured and taken away, leaving them with what was deemed sufficient to survive, often barely so. The tithe to the church was another significant obligation. A tenth of their produce was owed to the local parish, a contribution meant to support the clergy and the upkeep of the church. While the villagers were devout in their faith and found solace in the church's teachings, the tithe still represented another reduction in their already meager resources. These obligations, combined with the need to set aside enough seed for the following year's planting, often left the families with a precarious balance. A slightly smaller harvest than expected, a few more mouths to feed, or an unexpected illness could easily tip the scales towards hardship and hunger. Beyond the tangible dues of grain and livestock, there were other, less quantifiable demands placed upon the serfs. They were obligated to provide labor on the Lord's domain, the land directly controlled by Lord Harrington. This could involve working in his fields, repairing his buildings, or performing other tasks as required, often at crucial times when their own fields demanded attention. This forced labor, known as week work, was a significant drain on their time and energy, further limiting their ability to provide for their own families. There were also various customary dues and payments that punctuated their lives. A heriot was often levied upon the death of a peasant tenant, where the lord would claim the best beast or chattel as an inheritance tax. Marriage also often required the lord's permission and a payment, further reinforcing his control over their lives. The legal system, such as it was for the peasantry, offered little recourse against the lord's authority. Disputes were typically settled in the manorial court, presided over by the lord or his steward, where the interests of the lord invariably held sway. Justice for a serf was a rare and often unattainable commodity. This intricate web of obligations and dependencies shaped every aspect of Thomas's existence. It dictated how he worked, what he kept, and even, to some extent, how he lived his life. There was a constant awareness of his place in the social hierarchy, a deeply ingrained understanding of his subservient status. Yet, within this restrictive framework, the community of the village offered a vital source of support and resilience. They shared knowledge and resources, helped each other in times of need, and found strength in their collective identity. The harvest, while a time of intense individual labor, also culminated in communal celebrations, a brief release from the daily pressures. A moment to acknowledge their shared fate and the bounty of the land. The village priest, Father Michael, played an important role in their lives. He provided spiritual guidance, offered comfort in times of sorrow, and often served as a mediator in disputes within the community. His sermons reinforced the social order, emphasizing the importance of obedience and acceptance of one's station in life, but he also preached the virtues of charity and compassion, offering a moral compass in a sometimes harsh world. The beliefs in unseen forces and the cycles of the moon continued to permeate their daily lives. The success of the harvest was not solely attributed to their hard work and the weather. The favor of the spirits and the alignment of the celestial bodies were also considered crucial. Alara would still perform small rituals, burying symbolic offerings in the corners of their fields, whispering prayers for protection against blight and misfortune. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Scarcity. The bounty of the harvest, carefully gathered and stored, offered a fragile promise of security against the lean months ahead. Yet, for Thomas and his fellow villagers, this promise was always shadowed by the lurking specter of scarcity. A poor yield, a harsh winter, or an unexpected levy from the Lord could quickly erode their reserves, leaving them vulnerable to hunger and hardship. The memory of past famines, tales whispered by elders around the winter fires, served as a stark reminder of their precarious existence. They spoke of years when the rains had failed, the crops had withered in the fields, and the livestock had perished. In those times, desperation had driven people to unimaginable acts, and the bonds of community had been strained by the gnawing pangs of hunger. Even in a relatively good year like the present one, careful management of resources was paramount. Every grain of wheat, every root vegetable, every scrap of meat had to be used wisely. Alara was a master of thrift, her days filled with the meticulous tasks of preserving food for the winter. Salted meats hung from the rafters, root vegetables were stored in cool cellars, and fruits were dried in the faint autumn sun. Nothing was wasted. The forest, while holding its share of perceived dangers, also served as a vital source of supplementary food. Thomas would often venture into the woods to hunt for rabbits or squirrels, his knowledge of the animal trails and the subtle signs of their presence honed by years of necessity. Berries and nuts, gathered in season, provided additional sustenance, though these were often fiercely competed for among the villagers. The common land, the pasture where their few animals grazed, was another crucial resource. However, even this was subject to limitations and the Lord's regulations. Overgrazing could lead to fines, and access could be restricted at certain times of the year. The threat of disease, both among humans and livestock, added another layer of uncertainty to their lives. A sickness that swept through the village could leave families weakened and unable to work, further jeopardizing their ability to secure food for the winter. The loss of an ox or a cow, their invaluable partners in the fields, could be a devastating blow, crippling their ability to plow and transport goods. The harsh realities of their lives fostered a deep sense of interdependence within the village. Families relied on each other for support in times of crisis, sharing food, offering help with tasks, and providing comfort in times of loss. This communal spirit was a vital buffer against the individual vulnerabilities they faced. Yet, even within this community, tensions could arise, especially when resources were scarce. Disputes over grazing rights, access to firewood, or the sharing of meager supplies could lead to friction, testing the bonds of their collective existence. The changing weather remained a constant source of anxiety. An early frost could ruin the remaining crops in the fields, while prolonged autumn rains could make the paths impassable and hinder the transport of goods. The villagers watched the skies with a practiced eye, interpreting the subtle signs of impending changes, their livelihoods hanging precariously on the whims of nature. The superstitions surrounding the moon and other natural phenomena continued to influence their actions. Planting times were often aligned with lunar phases, and specific tasks were avoided on days considered unlucky. These beliefs, passed down through generations, offered a sense of control in a world where so much was beyond their understanding. The long nights of autumn brought a different kind of hardship, the gnawing cold. Their simple cottages offered little insulation, and fuel for the fire was a precious commodity. Families would huddle together for warmth, the flickering firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, their breath misting in the chill air. Despite these hardships, there was a quiet resilience in their spirit, a deep-seated determination to survive and to provide for their families. They possessed a practical wisdom, a knowledge of the land and its cycles that had been honed over centuries. They understood the rhythms of nature and had learned to adapt to its challenges. Small acts of kindness and generosity punctuated their lives. A sharing of a particularly successful hunt, an offer of help to a neighbor struggling with a task, a comforting word in times of sorrow. These small gestures reinforced the bonds of their community and offered glimmers of hope in the face of adversity. Thomas, looking at his children huddled together for warmth on a chilly autumn evening, felt the weight of his responsibility. He knew the winter ahead would be a challenge, but he was determined to work hard, to conserve their resources, and to draw strength from his family and his community. The shadow of scarcity loomed large, but it did not extinguish the small flame of hope that flickered within him, a hope rooted in the enduring spirit of survival that defined the lives of medieval farmers. The long evenings, as the days grew shorter, were often spent gathered around the hearth, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows on their faces. Stories were shared, not just the ancient tales of folklore, but also accounts of their own lives, the small triumphs and the many tribulations. These shared narratives helped to bind the community together, creating a sense of collective history and understanding. Thomas, despite the weight of his obligations and the constant struggle for survival, found small moments of contentment in these gatherings. In the warmth of his family, and in the simple beauty of the changing seasons. He knew his life was hard, a relentless cycle of labor and dependence. But it was also a life deeply connected to the land, to his community, and to the ancient rhythms of the natural world. As the time for the Lord's arrival drew nearer, a quiet tension settled over the village. The fruits of their labor were piled high, a testament to their efforts, but also a visible representation of what would soon be taken away. It was a stark reminder of the power that Lord Harrington held over their lives, a power as immutable as the turning of the seasons. Yet, within their hearts, there remained a quiet resilience, a determination to endure, to work the land, and to provide for their families, despite the heavy weight of the Lord's due. Viet Trian. Jem Tai Chin. Alright, let's continue the story, focusing on the small joys and moments of respite that punctuated the harsh realities of their lives. Chapter 5. The Embers of Community. Amidst the relentless cycle of labor and the ever-present anxieties, the villagers found solace and strength in their shared community. These were not grand celebrations or moments of extravagant joy, but rather small, flickering embers of human connection that provided warmth and light in the often dark landscape of their lives. The end of the harvest season, despite the looming presence of the Lord's bailiff, was often marked by a collective sigh of relief. The intense pressure of bringing in the crops had eased, and there was a brief lull before the full grip of winter settled upon the land. This was a time when the villagers might gather in the evenings, not for urgent work, but simply to be together. The small alehouse in the village, a dimly lit space filled with the murmur of voices and the faint aroma of brewed barley, served as a focal point for these gatherings. Here, over a shared tankard of weak ale, the men would exchange stories of the harvest, discuss the state of their livestock, and perhaps even share news from travelers passing through. These moments of camaraderie, though simple, helped to reinforce their sense of belonging and shared identity. For the women, gatherings often took place around shared tasks. Spinning wool by the light of the fire, mending clothes in the communal warmth of a larger cottage, or preparing food together offered opportunities for conversation and mutual support. They shared remedies for common ailments, offered advice on raising children, and passed down the traditional lore and wisdom of their community. The children, too, found their own forms of simple joy. They played games in the village green, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the more somber tones of adult conversation. They chased stray animals, built makeshift toys from scraps of wood and bone, and invented fantastical stories that transported them, for a brief time, beyond the confines of their daily lives. Sundays offered a respite from the demanding labor of the fields. The villagers would gather at the small stone church, their worn clothes a testament to their hard lives. The service, conducted in Latin which most did not fully understand, still provided a sense of spiritual connection and communal identity. Father Michael's sermons, often focusing on themes of perseverance and hope, offered a measure of comfort and guidance. Afterwards, the villagers would often linger outside the church, exchanging greetings and small talk before returning to their humble homes. The changing seasons brought their own small pleasures. The first wildflowers of spring, pushing through the thawing earth, offered a promise of renewal. The long, warm days of summer, despite the hard work, allowed for moments of rest in the shade of a tree, the gentle drone of bees a soothing soundtrack. The vibrant colors of autumn, before the starkness of winter set in, provided a visual feast, a reminder of the land's bounty. Even the long winter evenings, spent huddled around the hearth, held a certain charm. Stories were told, passed down through generations, keeping alive the history and folklore of their community. These tales of brave heroes, mischievous spirits, and the wisdom of the old offered entertainment and a sense of connection to the past. The crackling fire, the warmth shared with family, provided a sense of security against the cold darkness outside. The celebration of religious holidays, though often marked by simple rituals and meager feasts, offered moments of communal joy and spiritual reflection. The Nativity, the Easter celebrations, and the local saints' days provided breaks from the routine of agricultural life and reinforced their shared faith and cultural traditions. Music, in its simplest forms, also played a role in their lives. A shepherd's pipe carved from wood, simple songs sung during work in the fields, or the rhythmic clapping and stomping during a village gathering provided a form of emotional release and communal expression. These moments of respite and connection were not luxuries. They were essential for the survival of their spirits in a world that often demanded so much and offered so little in return. They provided the emotional sustenance that allowed them to face the daily hardships with a measure of resilience and hope. Thomas, returning from a long day in the fields, would often find a small measure of comfort in the sight of the village smoke rising in the evening air, a tangible symbol of the community that surrounded him. The sound of children's laughter carried on the breeze, or the faint strains of a simple song drifting from a nearby cottage, would remind him that even in their hard lives, there were moments of shared humanity and simple joy. These were the embers of their community, flickering but persistent, providing warmth and light in the long night of their medieval existence. Chapter 6: The Shadow of the Steeple. The towering silhouette of the village church steeple, a rough-hewn finger pointing towards the heavens, dominated the skyline of their small world. More than just a place of worship, the church was an integral part of the medieval peasant's life, its influence reaching into every aspect of their existence, from birth to death and beyond. Father Michael, the village priest, was a figure of considerable authority and respect. He was not only the spiritual guide of the community but also often the most educated person in the village, interpreting the scriptures and offering guidance on matters both spiritual and temporal. The church calendar dictated the rhythm of their year, punctuating the agricultural cycle with holy days and festivals. These days of rest from labor, though sometimes meager in their celebration, provided important breaks from the relentless toil in the fields. They were times for communal gathering, for reaffirming their faith, and for finding a sense of spiritual renewal. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals, the major milestones of life, were all conducted within the sacred walls of the church, each ritual imbued with deep religious significance. These ceremonies marked not just personal transitions but also reinforced the social fabric of the community, binding individuals together through shared faith and tradition. The teachings of the church shaped their understanding of the world and their place within it. Sermons emphasized the divine order, the acceptance of their earthly station, and the promise of heavenly reward for those who lived a virtuous and obedient life. While these teachings could reinforce the existing social hierarchy, they also offered a sense of purpose and meaning in lives often marked by hardship and injustice. The concept of sin and redemption was deeply ingrained in their consciousness. Confession offered a means of seeking forgiveness for transgressions, and the fear of eternal damnation served as a powerful motivator for moral behavior, at least outwardly. The church provided a framework for understanding suffering and loss, often attributing them to divine will or punishment for sin. The veneration of saints was a significant aspect of their piety. Each saint was believed to have particular areas of influence, and villagers would often invoke their intercession for protection against specific ailments, for a good harvest, or for other needs. Small shrines and images of saints could be found in their homes, serving as focal points for personal prayer. The tithe, the obligatory tenth of their produce given to the church, was a tangible reminder of the church's economic power. While it often represented a significant sacrifice for the already struggling peasants, it was generally accepted as a necessary contribution to the spiritual well-being of the community and the upkeep of the church. Belief in miracles and divine intervention was widespread. Unexpected good fortune might be attributed to the grace of God or the favor of a saint, while misfortunes could be seen as tests of faith or divine chastisement. The line between religious belief and folk superstition was often blurred, with ancient customs and beliefs about the natural world often intertwined with Christian doctrine. The church also played a role in providing limited forms of charity and social support. Monasteries often offered hospitality to travelers and the poor, and the local parish might provide some assistance to the most destitute members of the community, though resources were often scarce. However, the church was not immune to the complexities and contradictions of the medieval world. Wealth and power could sometimes lead to corruption and abuses within its ranks, though the local parish priest, often living a life of relative poverty alongside his flock, was usually seen as a more relatable and trustworthy figure. The annual pilgrimages to holy sites, though undertaken by only a few due to the time and expense involved, represented a significant expression of faith and a connection to the wider Christian world. These journeys were often fraught with peril but were seen as acts of deep devotion, offering the potential for spiritual healing and the remission of sins. For Thomas and his family, the church was a constant presence, a source of both comfort and obligation. They attended services regularly, contributed their tithe, and sought Father Michael's counsel in times of need. Their faith provided a framework for understanding their lives and offered hope for a better existence in the afterlife. The shadow of the steeple, therefore, was not just a physical presence in their landscape but also a powerful symbol of the spiritual and social forces that shaped their medieval world. Chapter 7. The Whispers of the Wild. Beyond the cultivated fields and the relative safety of the village, a wilder world existed, a realm of dense forests, untamed heaths, and winding rivers. While these areas provided essential resources like firewood, game, and grazing land, they also harbored a multitude of dangers, both real and imagined, that constantly threatened the fragile security of the villagers' lives. The forests, in particular, were seen as places of mystery and peril. Their dense canopies blocked out the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight where shadows danced and strange sounds echoed. Wild animals, such as wolves, boars, and even the occasional bear, posed a constant threat to livestock and unwary travelers. Stories of lone individuals venturing into the woods and never returning were common, fueling a deep-seated fear of the unknown that lay just beyond the edges of their familiar world. Beyond the threat of wild beasts, the forests were also believed to be inhabited by mythical creatures and malevolent spirits. Tales of mischievous fairies who led travelers astray, of wood nymphs who lured men to their doom, and of darker entities that preyed on the lost and vulnerable were whispered around the hearth fires at night. These beliefs, rooted in ancient folklore, served as a cautionary reminder to stay within the known boundaries and to respect the power of the wild. Travel beyond the immediate vicinity of the village was often fraught with risk. The roads, little more than rough tracks in many places, were poorly maintained and vulnerable to bandits and outlaws. Stories of travelers being robbed or even murdered were not uncommon, making any journey a potentially dangerous undertaking. The rivers, while providing a source of water and sometimes fish, also held their own perils. Unexpected floods could inundate low-lying areas, destroying crops and homes. Crossing the swift currents could be treacherous, and tales of drownings served as a stark warning to those who relied on the waterways. Even the seemingly open heaths and moorlands held hidden dangers. Bogs and quicksand could trap the unwary, and sudden changes in weather could leave travelers exposed and vulnerable. The vast, empty landscapes could also be disorienting, making it easy to lose one's way. The social unrest and occasional skirmishes between local lords added another layer of uncertainty to their lives. While the major conflicts of the kingdom might seem distant, the repercussions could still be felt in the villages. Armies passing through could requisition food and supplies, leaving the already meager resources depleted. The threat of violence and disruption was never entirely absent. Illness and disease, as mentioned before, were a constant danger, and their origins were often attributed to unseen forces or the malevolent influence of the stars. Outbreaks could spread rapidly through the close-knit communities, leaving a trail of suffering and death. There was little understanding of contagion, and remedies were often based on folklore and superstition, offering little real protection. The threat of fire was another ever-present fear. The thatched roofs and timber-framed houses of the village were highly flammable, and a single spark could quickly escalate into a devastating blaze, consuming homes and livelihoods in a matter of hours. Strict rules about fire safety were enforced, but accidents still occurred, leaving families destitute. Even the night itself held a certain unease. The darkness was often seen as a time when evil spirits were at their most powerful. Simple tasks like venturing out after nightfall were often accompanied by a sense of apprehension, and people preferred to remain within the relative safety of their homes once the sun had set. The light of the moon, while beautiful, was also associated with strange occurrences and heightened vulnerability. For Thomas and his family, these external dangers were a constant undercurrent to their daily lives. They were cautious when venturing beyond the village boundaries, mindful of the potential threats that lurked in the wilder world. They relied on the collective wisdom of the community, the shared knowledge of safe paths and potential hazards. to navigate the dangers that lay beyond their doorstep. The whispers of the wild, the rustling of unseen creatures in the forest, the creaking of branches in the wind, the distant howl of a wolf, these were constant reminders of the untamed forces that surrounded their small, fragile world. Survival in medieval times was not just about toiling the land. It was also about navigating a landscape filled with both real and imagined dangers. A world where the familiar routines of village life offered only a temporary shield against the uncertainties that lay beyond. Chapter 8. Echoes of the Distant World. The lives of the medieval villagers, though seemingly self-contained within the boundaries of their fields and the familiar paths of their community, were not entirely isolated from the wider world. Though direct contact was infrequent, echoes of events and people beyond their horizon occasionally reached their ears, bringing with them a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and a sense of the vastness of the world they barely knew. Travelers passing through the village were a primary source of these distant echoes. Merchants with their pack horses laden with goods from faraway towns, itinerant peddlers selling trinkets and spices, and the occasional wandering minstrel or storyteller brought news, rumors, and glimpses of a life beyond their own. These encounters were often brief, but they provided a window into a larger reality, sparking imaginations and offering a break from the routine of daily life. The news these travelers carried was often fragmented and unreliable, colored by personal biases and the distances it had traveled. Tales of powerful kings and their endless wars, of strange customs in distant lands, and of wondrous or terrifying events often lost their clarity in the retelling. Yet, they served to remind the villagers that their small world was but a tiny part of a much larger and more complex realm. Royal decrees or news of significant events, such as a new tax levied by the crown or a victory in a distant battle, might occasionally reach the village through official channels, perhaps read aloud by the Lord Steward or the village priest. These pronouncements, often delivered in formal language, were met with a mixture of resignation and unease, as they often carried implications for their already burdened lives. The church also served as a conduit to the wider world. Pilgrims returning from holy sites would share accounts of their journeys, their descriptions of grand cathedrals and bustling cities painting a picture far removed from the simplicity of their village. The teachings and pronouncements of the Pope and other high-ranking clergy, though filtered through the local priest, provided a sense of connection to a universal faith and a larger spiritual community. The lord of the manor, Lord Harrington, and his retinue occasionally journeyed to larger towns or castles, and upon their return, they might bring back news of the court, of political intrigues, or of new fashions and trends. These tidings, often relayed with a sense of grandeur and distance, offered a glimpse into the lives of the nobility, a world of power and privilege that was largely inaccessible to the common peasant. Fairs and markets held in nearby towns, though requiring a significant effort to attend, provided another opportunity for the villagers to interact with people from other communities. Here, they could trade their surplus goods, purchase essential items they could not produce themselves, and hear news and gossip from beyond their immediate vicinity. These gatherings, though primarily economic in nature, also served as social events, breaking the monotony of village life. The impact of events far away could sometimes be felt in tangible ways. A war in a distant land might lead to increased taxes or the conscription of young men from the village. A widespread famine elsewhere could drive up the price of essential goods, making survival even more challenging. These indirect connections served as a reminder that their lives, though seemingly isolated, were still subject to the ebb and flow of the larger world. Stories of mythical creatures in faraway lands, often fantastical and embellished, were also part of the oral tradition. Tales of dragons and giants, of lands flowing with milk and honey, or of perilous voyages across vast oceans offered a form of escapism and wonder, expanding the mental horizons of people whose physical world was so limited. The understanding of geography and the world beyond their immediate region was rudimentary at best. Maps were rare and inaccurate, and knowledge was largely based on hearsay and folklore. The world beyond their known paths remained a realm of mystery and speculation. For Thomas, these echoes of the distant world were often fleeting and difficult to fully grasp. He might overhear snippets of conversation at the alehouse or listen to Father Michael reading from a scroll. These glimpses into a larger reality served more as curiosities than as forces that directly shaped his daily life. His concerns remained rooted in the immediate realities of his fields, his family, and his community. Yet, these occasional connections to the outside world served an important purpose. They prevented their world from becoming entirely insular, reminding them that there was more beyond the familiar horizons. They sparked curiosity, fueled imaginations, and provided a sense, however vague, of belonging to a larger human tapestry. The echoes of the distant world, though faint and infrequent, were a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the medieval countryside, the currents of history and human experience continued to flow. Chapter 9. The Unfolding Cycle. The rhythm of life in the medieval village was deeply intertwined with the cyclical nature of the seasons, a predictable pattern of birth, growth, decay, and renewal that shaped their existence from one year to the next. This natural cycle was mirrored in the human experience, in the endless turning of generations, each facing similar hardships and joys, each contributing to the enduring fabric of the community. Births were a common occurrence, each new life a fragile hope for the future. A new pair of hands to work the land, a new voice to join the village chorus. The arrival of a child was a community affair, with the women gathering to assist the mother, sharing their knowledge and offering support. Despite the high rates of infant mortality, each birth was celebrated as a small victory against the uncertainties of life. Childhood was brief, a fleeting period between infancy and the assumption of responsibilities. Young children spent their days in simple play, mimicking the work of their parents, learning the skills they would need to survive. By the age of 7 or 8, they would begin to contribute to the household labor, helping with tasks in the fields or around the home, gradually being initiated into the demanding realities of adult life. Adolescence, as we understand it today, was almost non-existent. Young people quickly transitioned into adulthood. Their lives focused on work, marriage, and starting their own families. Marriage was often a practical arrangement, aimed at securing a partner for labor and procreation, though affection and companionship often grew over time. Adulthood was characterized by relentless work, the constant struggle to provide for oneself and one's family. The days were long and arduous, marked by the repetitive tasks of agriculture and the constant awareness of the precariousness of their existence. Yet, within this demanding routine, there were also moments of quiet satisfaction. The sense of accomplishment after a hard day's work, the simple joy of family. Old age, for those who survived the many perils of medieval life, was a time of gradual decline. A slowing of pace, but often a continuation of useful tasks within the community. The elderly were often respected for their wisdom and experience, their memories serving as a living history of the village. Death was an ever-present reality, a natural part of the cycle. Disease, accidents, and the harshness of life meant that few lived to what we would consider old age today. Funerals were solemn occasions, communal expressions of grief and remembrance, reinforcing the bonds of kinship and community in the face of loss. The churchyard, with its simple wooden crosses and weathered stones, served as a tangible reminder of the generations who had come before, who had toiled the same land and faced similar struggles. Despite the individual tragedies and hardships, the community as a whole persisted, an unbroken chain of lives connected by the land and their shared experiences. The knowledge and skills necessary for survival were passed down from one generation to the next, ensuring the continuity of their way of life. The stories and traditions of the village served as a cultural glue, binding them together through shared history and understanding. The land itself bore witness to this unfolding cycle. The same fields that Thomas plowed had been worked by his father and his grandfather before him. The ancient oak tree at the edge of the village green had seen countless generations of villagers pass beneath its branches. The winding paths through the fields had been trod by the feet of their ancestors. The superstitions and beliefs that permeated their lives also contributed to this sense of continuity. The cycles of the moon, the changing seasons, the patterns of the natural world, all were imbued with meaning and significance, connecting them to a deeper, more ancient understanding of existence. Even the lord of the manor and the feudal system, despite their inherent inequalities, provided a form of continuity. The land remained under the control of the same noble family for generations, and the obligations and expectations of the serfs remained largely unchanged. For Thomas, this unfolding cycle was the very rhythm of his life. He had witnessed births, mourned deaths, and toiled the land through countless seasons. He saw his children growing, slowly entering the same cycle of labor and responsibility that defined his own existence. He knew that one day, he too would join those who lay in the churchyard, his memory living on in the stories and the land he had worked. There was a certain acceptance in this understanding, a recognition of the natural order of things. Life was hard, but it was also a part of a larger, enduring pattern. The sun would continue to rise and set, the seasons would continue to turn, and the village, with its cycle of birth, life, and death, would continue to exist, a testament to the resilience and continuity of the human spirit in the face of an ever-changing world. All right. Let's bring our story to a close, reflecting on the enduring spirit and the quiet dignity of the medieval farmer's life. Chapter 10: The Enduring Earth. As the years turned, marked by the familiar cycle of planting and harvest, Thomas felt the slow but inexorable weight of time upon his own body. The aches in his joints were more persistent, his steps a little slower, and the lines etched on his face deepened like the furrows in his fields. Yet, his connection to the land, the enduring earth that had sustained him and his ancestors, remained as strong as ever. He had seen his children grow, each in their own time taking on the responsibilities of adulthood, mirroring the life he and Alara had lived. Some had remained in the village, continuing the traditions of farming, while others had sought their fortunes in nearby towns, their paths diverging from the familiar rhythms of rural life. Alara, too, bore the marks of their shared journey. Her hands, once nimble, were now gnarled with age, but her spirit remained steadfast, her wisdom a quiet anchor for the family. Together, they had weathered countless seasons, faced hardships and known small joys, their lives inextricably bound to the fortunes of the land and the ebb and flow of their community. The village itself had seen its share of changes, subtle shifts in the patterns of life, the occasional new family arriving, the inevitable departures. The ancient oak tree at the green still stood sentinel, its branches reaching towards the sky like gnarled fingers, a silent witness to generations past and present. The feudal system, the framework of their society, remained largely unchanged, the obligations to the lord a constant undercurrent in their lives. Yet, within this structure, the small acts of human kindness, the bonds of community, and the resilience of the human spirit continued to flourish. The beliefs and superstitions that had shaped their understanding of the world persisted, passed down through stories and traditions. The phases of the moon still held their significance, the whispers of the wild still carried a hint of mystery, and the comforting presence of the church steeple continued to watch over the village. As Thomas walked through his fields in the twilight of his years, the familiar scent of the earth rising to meet him, he felt a deep sense of belonging. His life had been one of hard labor, of constant struggle against the elements and the demands of the world. There had been times of scarcity and times of relative plenty, moments of joy and moments of sorrow. But through it all, there had been a profound connection to the land, a sense of purpose in the rhythm of the seasons, and the unwavering support of his family and community. There was a quiet dignity in the life of a medieval farmer, a deep understanding of the fundamental cycles of existence, a reliance on the enduring power of the earth. He had learned the language of the land, the subtle signs of its moods, the secrets of its bounty. He had witnessed the miracle of a tiny seed transforming into life-sustaining grain, the resilience of nature in the face of harsh conditions. He understood the interconnectedness of all things, the delicate balance between humanity and the natural world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the fields he had toiled for so long, Thomas felt a sense of peace. His life had been simple, perhaps even harsh by the standards of later times. But it had been a life lived in accordance with the ancient rhythms of the earth, a life deeply rooted in community and tradition. The enduring earth had sustained generations before him, and it would continue to sustain those who came after. The cycle would continue, the seasons would turn, and the small village, nestled in the heart of the countryside, would carry on. Its people bound by the land and the enduring spirit of survival. And in the quiet stillness of the evening, as the crickets began their nightly chorus and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, there was a sense of continuity, a sense that even in the face of individual mortality, the life of the land, and the enduring spirit of its people, would continue to unfold, season after season, generation after generation, rooted in the timeless embrace of the earth. The whispers of the wind through the ripening wheat, the soft glow of the moon on thatched roofs, the distant murmur of the village, these images, like echoes from a time long past, linger in the quiet spaces of our minds. We have walked in the muddy boots of Thomas, felt the ache in his back, the weight of his worries, and the simple warmth of his hearth. We have seen the relentless cycle of his labor, the shadow of the Lord's dew, the ever-present threat of scarcity, and the small, precious embers of community that sustained him. We have journeyed through the turning seasons, witnessed the fragility of life and the enduring power of hope. We have glimpsed the unseen forces that shaped their beliefs, the towering presence of the church in their daily lives, and the wild, untamed world that lay just beyond the familiar fields. We have heard the faint echoes of a larger world reaching their isolated village and felt the deep connection to the land that defined their existence. And we have observed the continuous unfolding of life, death, and renewal, the timeless rhythm that bound generations together. Now, as the tapestry of Thomas's life gently fades, perhaps you too can feel the quiet strength that sustained him, the deep connection to the earth that anchored his days, and the enduring spirit of community that offered solace in a harsh world. The echoes of his time, though distant, remind us of the fundamental human experiences that transcend the centuries: the love for family, the struggle for survival, and the enduring hope for a better tomorrow. Now you can close your eyes and let the currents of time take you away. Let the gentle rhythm of the past carry you on a peaceful journey. As the whispers of the medieval countryside fade into the quiet stillness of the present, the enduring earth continues its cycle, and the stories of those who toiled upon it remain a testament to the resilience and quiet dignity of lives lived close to the land. Sleep now, and may your rest be as deep and as peaceful as the slumber of the ancient fields under the soft light of the moon.